Hello YouTube, my name is James and I run a channel called Anamnesis. And this video is an introduction to a series of videos that I'm working on, analyzing Mencius Moldbug, neo-reaction, and some of the central themes of Unqualified Reservations. It's just a brief intro to the series, one which Dave has been so kind as to promote during his hiatus, but it's kind of a meta video, not anything with any real ideas, more of just an overview of what it is that I'm working on. So if it speaks to you at all, there are more videos in the series with actual content that you can check out on my channel, which I assume will be linked in the description. And of course, more videos coming down the pipeline. And so, with that out of the way, on to the video. So, Mencius Moldbug, pen name of a one Curtis Yarvin, computer programmer and entrepreneur out of the Silicon Valley tech scene, made internet famous in 2007 for his beloved brainchild, what was hailed as the first ever meta-political blog, Unqualified Reservations, which will hereafter be referred to as UR. The birth of UR might best be described as a declaration of libertarian apostasy, a post-ANCAP manifesto, perhaps. You see, libertarianism had spent decades failing to gain any traction in the mainstream, and Moldbug sought to shine a bit of perspective in the wake of libertarianism's apparent failures. The major disconnect was that libertarian foundational principles seemed really hard to argue with when taken at face value. Liberty, political freedom, voluntary association, the non-aggression principle, really, who can argue with any of these things? It's basically the political incarnation of live and let live, the simplified and distilled wisdom of the Enlightenment ethos that's driven the West for at least the past 2 centuries. Really, it doesn't get any more American than that. At some level, it all just seems so painfully obvious. So, why isn't libertarianism catching on? In fact, if poll numbers are to be believed, why is it getting less popular with each passing year? It seemed increasingly unable to compete on the playing field that they themselves had championed for so many years, unable to compete on its own terms. Peter Thiel summed up the resulting disillusionment perfectly in 2009 when, in what might be the closest thing neo-reaction ever had to mainstream exposure, he wrote in an article for the Cato Institute, quote, "I no longer believe democracy and freedom are compatible. It was all coming apart at the seams. Clearly, we had gotten some assumptions wrong somewhere down the line. Clearly, this puzzle was missing some pieces." And on top of all that, there were a lot of other questions that seemed eerily absent from the conversation, questions for which the mainstream right-wingers didn't really have a good answer. Conservative and libertarian media is replete with examples of absurd leftist behavior in all its most bizarre and exotic forms. The shaming, the bullying, the theatrics, the histrionics, the total lack of conscience, the list is endless. Just listen to any Republican talk show or internet program for more than a few minutes, and like clockwork, they almost have nothing better to talk about. It's like, yeah, we get it. They're hypocrites. This is old news. What none of them seem to be interested in is the more pressing question of why the left is acting this way, and why is it working? They do have their own explanations for this kind of thing, of course. They'll probably just tell you that leftists are just a bunch of spoiled college kids who are blowing otherwise innocuous statements out of proportion, probably due to some genuine miscommunication or misunderstanding about their opposition or the way the world works. I believe the technical term is snowflakes. They might occasionally dive into some psychoanalysis, talking about how leftists are just insecure or emotionally unstable. Maybe they're just lazy, or maybe they just want free stuff from the government. And sure, all that stuff is probably true, to a degree. And this is probably the case for your average leftist on the street, your friends, your neighbors, second-rate professors, the rich yuppie trust fund kids that comprise the ranks of Antifa. But this theory starts to fall apart as you move up the chain of command. That explains why college kids are doing this, but why is the media egging them on? And their universities, journalists, everyone in the mainstream news, megacorporations, tech giants, advertisers, shareholders, politicians, the global financial system, leaders of first world countries, the UN, the Pope? Is the Pope a snowflake? Is it really likely that all these international organizations, institutions, and global leaders have just been co-opted by a bunch of insecure teenagers? That the entire planet is run by people who just can't take a joke? The snowflake explanation, reassuring to the conservative psyche though it may be, really just leaves more questions than it answers. But while we're on the subject, conservative behavior was no less bizarre and inexplicable. They spend an absurd amount of time and effort valiantly trying to prove how unbigoted they are, pursuing amnesty and immigration strategies that will demonstrably make it impossible for them to win elections anywhere, in a very obvious and statistically validated way, pandering to demographics that have never and will never vote for them, which predictably ends up alienating their actual voter base, and also has the peculiar double whammy effect of not gaining them any favor with the progressives whatsoever, because at the end of the day, they're still racists, and they always will be. One who sympathizes with their ostensible causes just can't help but notice their obsession with failed political strategies and how the only thing that ever actually seems to inspire them into effective action is purging their party of anyone who could actually help them win. There seems to be some inexplicable masochism in always playing the part of the left's cartoon supervillain. At this point, it's just kind of a foregone conclusion, but again, why? And it doesn't just stop at the parties. One still can't help but be perplexed by the deeper existential questions presented by the events of the political circus. The war on white males, the undermining of the middle class, all the most stable and productive demographics. This is old news, of course, but it still misses the big picture. Why would the leaders of a country seek to proactively undermine their most economically productive citizens? Why would they punish the people who are keeping the whole system afloat with absurd redistributionist policies? Why would they purposely flood their country with third world immigrants and then promise them all kinds of free money and resources? Even from the perspective of pure, cold economic self interest, this seems to be the political equivalent of putting a virus on your own computer. Our leaders are supposed to be leading the country, not burning it. No, there's clearly other factors at play here, and the mainstream political landscape has no answer to any of these questions. In fact, the nature of all this behavior doesn't even seem to register as outlandish on their radar. For them, it's just business as usual. And though leftist insanity wasn't operating at quite the same scale back in 2007, these dynamics were still in play. Even back then, at least in nascent form. And so, Moldbug went to work, pulling out a whole host of obscure texts from the darker corners of the Mises Institute, Google books, and some of the more extreme elements of paleoconservatism, pulling a whole bunch of seemingly disparate ideas and schools of thought which had previously been lost into the annals of history and tying them together into a kind of modernized reactionary frame of reference, giving a new spin on an old perspective, so to speak. His project, and the project of UR, was to diagnose the ills of the contemporary political landscape and, more importantly, just make sense of all this. And he was prolific. In the 5 to 6 years that UR was active, he managed to churn out over 4,500 pages worth of writings, the majority of which were written in the first 3 or 4 years of UR's lifespan. To say that he laid an immense foundation would be an understatement. And sure enough, it set off a whole bunch of lively and animated discussion during its heyday, but it was short-lived. Moldbug officially declared the project defunct in 2016, and the conversation dried up just as quickly as it had come. And now a lot of it has been relegated to the Internet Archive, mostly on the fancy new UR website. Neo-reaction itself has become somewhat of a historical oddity. Nowadays, the only artifact that really seems to be left is the open letter to progressives and the gentle introduction to UR. Between the two of them, they account for the vast majority of Moldbugian ideas that still find their way into the discussion, and not to hate on those posts, they are important and full of great ideas and very much worth reading. But the problem is that those two series themselves were designed to be summaries. See, Moldbug wrote a lot of important things before those posts. He wrote a lot of important things between those posts, and he wrote a lot of important things after those posts, the vast majority of which has been neglected in lieu of the more popular pieces, leaving us with vast swaths of uncharted territory. The big series posts were meant to be gateways into the world of UR, not necessarily ends in and of themselves, at least when they were written. They give the big picture, but they skim over a lot of really important details, or in some cases even omit them completely. And as one reads through the UR corpus, the ideas aren't just laid out end to end. You get the impression that Moldbug himself was working through all of this in real time, fleshing things out, trying to circle in on some key insights, and experimenting with new ways to articulate them. All the good arguments and elaboration, it's all disjointed. The project is complete, but disorganized. UR isn't a formal treatise because it wasn't meant to be. It's more like a very long brainstorming session, a kind of dialogue with his commenters and other bloggers. Moldbug has been criticized more than once for his inconsistencies and his mistakes, and perhaps even the occasional blatant contradiction, but that was kind of the point. He was trying to figure all this stuff out too. And sure enough, there's a certain kind of evolution to the project as he elaborates more and more on a key set of themes. All of which is to say, the open letter and gentle intro were better thought of as part of this evolution, points on the timeline, rather than the finished product itself. The popular pieces are important, but I don't think they tell the whole story, at least not by themselves. Again, the foundation Moldbug laid cannot be overstated. Given the sheer magnitude of UR's backlog, I think it deserves some proper analysis, more so than the big series posts really have to offer. And so that's the starting point of this project, and my plan for the series of videos that will follow this one. I'm going to trace back through the UR backlog, maybe try to puzzle out some of the more salient lines of thought and see how Moldbug elaborated on them over the course of UR's lifespan, maybe reintroduce some ideas that got lost in translation. The goal is really just overall to pull a whole bunch of scattered thoughts into a more complete picture, but beyond that, to also act as a kind of resource for those who want to journey out beyond the more popular posts and aren't sure where the hell else to even start or what's even worth reading. There's a lot going on in Moldbug's world. It can be kind of daunting, and I want to paint out the big picture with enough detail so that anybody can drop in on pretty much any random post in the UR backlog and have enough context to get the most out of it. So as such, each video will have some supplementary reading material in the description, probably a whole lot more than anybody will ever care to read, but it's there. You should totally check it out at your leisure. Now, just to be clear, I know there's been a lot of elaboration on Moldbug's ideas since he wrote all this stuff. Neo-reaction experienced a lot of evolution, whole new lines of thought from a number of intelligent people, some of which are utterly ridiculous, and others which are arguably even more sensible than Moldbug's own formulations of certain topics, a lot of which is fascinating and totally worth reading in its own right, but I'm not going to focus on any of that for this series. I'm not even going to focus on the American mind writings of Moldbug's less exciting alter ego, Curtis Yarvin. No, this is solely focused on the arc of Unqualified Reservations, by itself, in a vacuum, no more, no less. And I'm also just going to assume that whoever's listening to this has never encountered reactionary thought before, if only for the sake of completeness. Which isn't to say you shouldn't, by the way. Please, by all means, go read some Moldbug before jumping into all of this. The gentle intro, the open letter, they're good posts for getting your feet wet. But for those who are short on time, I'll post some links to other shorter posts in the description that are fine starting points as well. And, maybe you can at least skim over them. But this is YouTube. Reading is tragically out of fashion in the year 2020, so we're starting from square one. And so, with all the administrative stuff out of the way, we'll get started with all the good stuff in the next video.